Hello everybody. So for today's video, we are going to look at the effects of World War II on the home front in the United States during after December 7th, after the U.S. declares war on Japan and Nazi Germany. Um, America's involvement in the Second World War ends up having massive repercussions on American society. In many ways, many of the post-war social movements and much of the post-war prosperity that the United States enjoys after World War II can be attributed directly to things that happened during wartime, as well as kind of the earlier improvements in the social and political fabric that came about as a result of the New Deal. So let's kind of dive into some of those changes. Now, first things first. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, it pretty much is one of those galvanizing moments in American history. It's one of those defining moments. And it does something that very few moments in American history have done before or since. And that is that it creates pretty much instantaneous unity of purpose and sentiment in the United States. Um, Not even 9/11 or our current crisis that we're living through have produced, levels of unity that have lasted very long. But with Pearl Harbor, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor produces a level of unity and a sense of purpose, and let's not sugarcoat it, a desire for revenge against the Japanese that ultimately proves to be enough to sustain an American war effort for nearly 4 years. And so, how does that end up reshaping American society? Well, World War II on the home front ends up having many areas where there's massive social changes that come about. For one thing, the level of governmental involvement in Americans' daily life increases a lot during World War II. The government imposes rationing of critical resources, meat, vegetables, gas, rubber for automobile tires. All of these things are very strictly rationed. People are given handbooks, ration coupons for certain consumer goods, and to ensure that places selling consumer goods, which are now considerably scarcer than they were before December 7th, from to discourage retailers from gouging consumers, the government puts in place price controls on many areas of the American economy as well. So you have rationing, you have price controls. You in many American cities, especially coastal cities, you have curfews and blackouts, and so there's a much greater degree of regimentation and regulation of everyday American life than there was before December 7th, 1941. Um, but beyond that, kind of regimentation and regulation of the ebb and flow of daily life that the war produces, it also ends up having some other rather significant ramifications that will reach far into the American future. For one thing, the war pretty much immediately ends the Great Depression. Uh, the depression that had begun in October of 1929, although it had been, kind of the suffering it caused had been lessened to a certain degree. Um, the depression itself hadn't really been tamed. Prior to American entry into the Second World War, unemployment remained high, and really just fighting the depression proved to be very difficult, even with the massive governmental efforts of the New Deal. But World War II pretty much immediately ends the depression, and it does so for a couple of reasons. One, um, the Selective Service Act that had been signed into law the year before the United States enters the Second World War in 1940 would ultimately bring about the induction of more than 16 million men into uniform during World War II. During World War II, more than 16 million people are inducted into military service. This is from a pre-war military of around 150,000, which is actually smaller than the army of Romania at the start of hostilities. The United States arguably was already in a strong position to help the Allies when Pearl Harbor was attacked. It was already providing massive amounts of military aid to the Allies through the Lend-Lease Act. But the U.S. itself wasn't really in a very good position to fight a war, not especially not a two-front one. But because of the surge of enthusiasm produced by Pearl Harbor, the military has no problem meeting enlistment goals. In fact, the number of voluntary enlistments and the bureaucratic issues that produces is actually so substantial that eventually in December of 1942, President Roosevelt signs an executive order that does away completely with voluntary enlistment, save for those under the age of 18 who have to receive permission from their parents, and those over the age of 38 who are considered older than the standard age for conscription, and have to basically prove that they're still fit enough to serve. So basically, after 1942, all the people who are put into uniform are draftees, people who had been inducted, had been drafted. So that's an important part of that. Of that 16 million people, about 350,000 are women. And women definitely see some rather substantial social changes coming about as a result of the Second World War. Even though those changes won't prove to be, at least immediately, long term. Basically, with millions of men being inducted into service to fight the wars in the Pacific and in Europe, massive vacancies open in American factories, and as a result, millions of women end up finding work during World War II in jobs that had previously been all male occupations: welders, machinists, riveters, of course, famously Rosie the Riveter, this very famous, kind of archetype of female involvement and empowerment during the Second World War. By 1943, 65% of the workforce in the aircraft industry was female. So most of those bombers and fighters and other planes that rolled off American assembly lines, by and large, they were built by women. So, that kind of disproved some pre-war notions about the kind of work that women could do competently. Women also worked in shipyards and munitions plants and a wide range of other industrial activities during the war as well. In addition to the large numbers of American women who found work in factories or defense plants, as I mentioned, about 350,000 volunteered for service during the Second World War in all-female auxiliaries of the Army, Navy, Marine Corps, and Coast Guard, as well as around 1,000 women who belong to the Women's Air Force Service Pilots, or WASPs, who ferried planes from factories directly to the front lines. So large numbers of American women joined the military. Because of, unlike in the Soviet military, where women were employed as tank commanders, fighter pilots, snipers, most famously, and pretty much any other typical soldier job you can imagine. In the U.S. and in Great Britain, women were relegated largely to non-combat roles, though some female nurses served in Army surgical hospitals that were quite close to the front line. But anyway, even though they were essentially relegated to non-combat roles, women filled vital functions in the military infrastructure during World War II. And as a result, it's because of this that women's service on a permanent basis is eventually guaranteed in 1948. Prior to World War II, um, there wasn't really a role for women in the military. But as a result of the large numbers of women who served in various non-combat functions quite effectively during the war, after World War II was ended, um, you know, women are allowed to enlist in the military on a permanent basis as of 1948. So that's a major societal change. Um, in addition to large numbers of women who worked in munitions factories and aircraft factories, and women who volunteered for service during the war, um, many American women, even those who couldn't work outside the home, planted victory gardens to supplement their own food supply or to donate food to the Allies, to Allied food efforts, and organized scrap drives in their local communities. This is something that, if, again, to reference "It's a Wonderful Life," this is what they show George Bailey's wife doing in the context of that movie, or organizing the USO or what have you. Um, Now, after the war ended, much of the female employment that the war produced very quickly evaporates. But the memory of women being able to perform jobs that were prior to the war considered to be, you know, men's work, basically, persisted. And so, although there is a period of retrenchment in terms of gender norms and societal attitudes about women's role in the workforce after World War II, with this kind of re-embrace of the 19th century cult of domesticity, the memory of Rosie the Riveter and the Wasps and the Wax and others like them would ultimately prove to be a potent image that would influence women's movements that would begin galvanizing American society in the 1960s and the 1970s, and continue to inspire people all the way up to the present. So again, the long-term impact of this is a little bit more limited than some other areas that we'll be discussing, but is nonetheless still very significant, in my opinion. Now, if women saw new, albeit largely temporary, gains in American society during World War II, another group that World War II proves to be rather significant for long term is and the effects of which prove to be much more long lasting is African Americans. Um, Essentially, World War II will act as one of the galvanizing forces behind the post-war civil rights movement. Another major galvanizing force will be the Cold War. And the reason for that is essentially the same reason that it would be with the Cold War. During World War II, American propaganda portrayed the United States as a country that was simultaneously both fighting a war to defend democracy and also simultaneously to defeat intolerance. That message of fighting for democracy and defeating intolerance kind of rang hollow in a country where most of the black population living in the South was denied access to basic rights like the right to vote, as well as denied equal employment and educational opportunities, and a whole raft of other areas where African Americans were systematically segregated and otherwise denied full access to the fruits of American society. And that kind of hypocrisy, that kind of duality did not go unnoticed during the war. And so during World War II, many African American, many prominent leaders in the black community used the rhetoric of freedom and democracy and opposition to intolerance that the American involvement in the war represented as a platform to advocate for greater civil rights for African Americans. And they referred to this as double victory. Um, A. Philip Randolph, the head of the largest African American union in the United States at the time period, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, actually pushed President Roosevelt to eventually sign an executive order that barred discrimination in the hiring in munitions factories and other factories that received government contracts. And so as a result of that, during World War II, and because of the labor shortages that World War II produced, large numbers of African Americans, about 5.5 million altogether, moved out of the rural South where they were denied economic and political freedoms into the urban North and West in places like St. Louis and Philadelphia and Chicago and Los Angeles, where they oftentimes were still treated as second-class citizens, and in some cases greeted by angry white mobs, and as in the case of the 1943 Detroit race riot. But they could participate in the political system, they could vote. And so ultimately, the relocation of large numbers of African Americans out of the rural South into the urban and industrial North and West would end up having massive political repercussions for the post-war period. It essentially made African American voters a much more powerful voting bloc than they had been prior to World War II, and one whose needs and issues could no longer be ignored by politicians seeking national office, which is one of the reasons why the civil rights movement really kind of takes off after World War II. Another reason is because of the service of African American veterans themselves. During World War II, out of the 16 million men who served in uniform, nearly 1 million were African Americans. And although many were relegated to labor battalions or cooking duties, you do have a handful of African American combat units, most famously the Tuskegee Airmen, but also units like the 92nd and 93rd Infantry Divisions, which fought in Italy and the Pacific, respectively. The 761st Independent Tank Battalion, which fought in the Battle of the Bulge and Normandy, and the Montfort Point Marines, who stormed the beaches of Iwo Jima and Peleliu. And all of these units acquired sterling records during the war. And so when the war ended, and many of these vets returned home from the war, having fought to liberate Europe or the Pacific and to free it from the grip of totalitarianism and intolerance, many were unwilling to resume the pre-war status quo. And a big part of that also has to do with the fact that many returning veterans, although they certainly had served their country honorably, when they returned would be denied access to the benefits that they had earned, most notably the GI Bill. So we'll get more into that in a later video, but it is definitely an important part of that. So World War II really does prove to be a major kind of springboard, in a sense, for the civil rights movement that would emerge in the United States really pretty much immediately after the war ended, and which would have become a major talking point socially and politically for decades to come. And it's no coincidence that many of the early leaders of the civil rights movement, or many of the early notables at least, in the civil rights movement, were themselves World War II veterans, like Jackie Robinson and Medgar Evers, both of whom served in the military during World War II. So that's another important part of that. Now, another major repercussion of World War II, in addition to it inadvertently kind of serving as a springboard for the civil rights movement after the war ended, was the way that it affected and really kind of paved the way for post-war prosperity. Part of this was because of the massive expansion of industry that occurred during the war. During World War II, pretty much when the war began, President Roosevelt immediately issued an order for American industries to convert their factories from manufacturing civilian consumer goods, cars, toys, typewriters, refrigerators, and such, to manufacturing the goods that the United States and its allies needed to win the war. And American industries responded both forcefully and quite quickly. It's really quite remarkable. Within a matter of about 6 months from the attack on Pearl Harbor, most of major American industries were able to convert their production from manufacturing civilian consumer goods to manufacturing war material. For example, General Motors' Eastern Motors Division in New Jersey, which made Buick and Chevy trucks before the war, um, or Buick's, GM and Chevys before the war. They manufactured the FM2 Wildcat and TBM Avenger bombers that flew off the decks of American aircraft carriers, including the Avenger bomber flown by future President George H.W. Bush off the deck of the USS San Jacinto in 1943. Another example would be Ford Motor Company. Ford ended up building this massive plant in Willow Run, Michigan, which was actually the largest factory complex in the world at the time period, which manufactured B-24 Liberator bombers that pounded Nazi oil fields during World War II. But it wasn't just limited to the big three. Chrysler built M4 Sherman tanks that ruled across Nazi-occupied Europe in 1944. Um, it wasn't just limited to automobile manufacturers. The Smith Corona Typewriter Company manufactured the 1903 Springfield rifle for American troops. The Remington Rand Typewriter Company of Syracuse, New York, made more 1911 pistols than Colt and Ithaca, the other two major government contractors combined during World War II, both of which were nominally primarily gun makers before the war. Um, the Lionel Toy Train Company of New Jersey went from making a children's toy to making compasses that were put on Navy destroyers and destroyer escorts. So you have literally, the gamut of American industry, industries big and small, converting from manufacturing civilian goods and civilian consumer products to manufacturing, weapons, planes, tanks, guns, and other types of equipment. Here in St. Louis, the American Can Company switched from making canned goods to making torpedoes that were fired from submarines and from Navy torpedo bombers like the Avenger. Um, so, you have all kinds of stuff like that. Now, as part of that massive reconversion, you also had, in many cases, industry having to apply considerable degrees of ingenuity. The war created some pretty significant problems. And really up until 1943, one of the biggest problems facing the Allies was the fact that Allied merchant ships were being sunk by German submarines faster than Allied shipyards could build them. And so during the war, a American shipbuilding magnate named Henry Kaiser, he develops this thing called the Liberty ship, and it's very ugly. It's very crude, but basically what it does is he would have prefabricated parts that would be manufactured off-site, that would then be sent to a shipyard, usually in Washington, in Bremerton, Washington, or Mobile, Alabama, or somewhere on the East Coast. And basically, those prefabricated parts would arrive at a shipyard where an army of primarily female and African American workers would turn these things into a merchant ship. And they would be able to churn out these merchant ships through the use of prefabricated parts in rapid time. Instead of it taking a year to build a merchant ship, it would take a few weeks. And so as a result of this, the Allies were able to churn out, the US was able to churn out thousands of these ships, enabling American supplies to reach Europe, as well as, in some cases, converting these Liberty ships into, kind of slow escort carriers, like the ones that were used in the Battle of the Atlantic. So that wartime ingenuity, the pioneering of the use of prefabricated parts and technologies, that would find later application after the war was over in the massive expansion of suburbia after World War II, the use of prefabricated components that would fuel suburban growth after World War II. Those were techniques that were first pioneered in the context of wartime emergency during World War II. So that's another example of how World War II's, the economic conversion of World War II ends up providing a massive leg up for the future. Um, and American productivity very quickly outpaces anything that the Germans or the Japanese can come up with. By the end of the war, the United States is making more, had produced more aircraft, more ships, more tanks um, than Nazi Germany, Italy, and Japan combined twice over. And by 1945, fully 60% of all manufactured goods were made in the United States. Now, accompanying that massive industrial explosion that occurs during the war, that massive expansion of American industry, is a massive expansion of American unions. Um, by the end of World War II, fully 1/3 of the American workforce belonged to unions. And that provided yet another major component of the post-war prosperity that Americans would come to enjoy in the post-war period, because with unions came higher wages, better benefits, and you know a certain level of stability that helped fuel that massive suburban uh, prosperity, that massive post-war prosperity after World War II. Now, all of this did come with a bit of a downside. And certainly one of the biggest downsides of the kind of unity that the war produced is where that unity is really directed to. World War II definitely produces a lot of sense of unity and commonality of purpose, but it also really focuses a lot on developing a very, very intense hatred of the enemy, particularly the Japanese. The Japanese, in particular, are portrayed during World War II in decidedly racialized terms. Official propaganda from the war, if you watch any wartime, cartoons or propaganda, the Japanese are always portrayed as sneaky and deceptive. In cartoons, they're oftentimes portrayed as buck-toothed and cross-eyed and having sallow skin, basically less than human. And so that intense racialized hatred of the enemy finds itself redirected on Japanese Americans during the war, which of course also, is exacerbated by decades of, anti-Asian prejudice going all the way back to the Chinese Exclusion Act in the 1880s. Um, when the war begins, many on the West Coast, uh, many political and economic leaders in the West Coast begin pushing President Roosevelt to round up the Japanese American population in the West Coast, claiming that these people had dual loyalties, that they weren't really true Americans, even though 2/3 of them were born in the United States and had never been to Japan and were born citizens, and basically saying that these people might act as a sort of fifth column for the Japanese, sabotaging the American war effort. And so, in spite of the fact that the actual majority of Japanese Americans lived in the Hawaiian Islands, where they made up 1/3 of the population, in early 1942, President Roosevelt issues Executive Order 9066, in which he orders the internment of all Japanese Americans primarily living in the West Coast, placing them in 10 internment camps for the duration of the war. Now, again, these were people who had done no crime, had never voiced any disloyalty to their country, and in many cases proved to be as eager, if not more eager, than their white and black counterparts to prove their patriotism to the U.S. during the war by enlisting. And they're put in these camps. Again, in spite of the fact that most of these that 2/3 of them are American citizens. Now, eventually, this clear violation of basic due process and amongst other civil rights that are violated by this is challenged legally. In 1944, it goes all the way to the Supreme Court, the Korematsu v. U.S. decision. In that decision, the Supreme Court upholds the executive order ordering the internment of the 120 odd thousand Japanese Americans living in the West Coast, primarily in California, Oregon, and Washington, under the guise of, quote, wartime necessity. In spite of the hardship that these Japanese American face, which involved being, losing their businesses, being forcibly relocated to oftentimes desolate areas of the country, primarily in Wyoming and Idaho, in these army camps where they were kept under armed guard day and night, surrounded by barbed wire. Again, many proved to be as eager, if not more eager, to prove their patriotism to the country during the war. And in fact, during World War II, the most decorated American unit to fight in the war, the 100th 442nd Regimental Combat Team, was comprised entirely of Japanese Americans. And they would ultimately go on to become the most decorated American unit in American history. Eventually, in 1988, during the Reagan administration, the government did formally apologize to the remaining survivors of internment and did pay a one-time reparation of around $20,000 per person to those who were still alive, which scarcely, accounted for the more than $400 million in property and economic activity that was lost as a result of internment. So again, a period that generally characterizes, in my opinion, many of the best attributes of the American spirit, but also one that brings out, in the case of Japanese internment, some of the darkest. So with that said, we're going to move on to our next video, which is going to look at the war in the Pacific against Japan itself.